It had been an unusually dry spring, the kind that made your skin crack and lips stay parched no matter how much water you drank. Out here in our little stretch of semi-rural suburbia, where lawns browned by May and the air smelled faintly of dust, folks got creative to keep their plants alive. For me, it was my rain barrels. 6 of them, neatly lined behind the garden shed, tucked just enough out of sight to not disturb the neighborhood's beige-loving sensibilities. I'd installed them years ago, partly for the garden, partly out of stubborn pride in not letting good water go to waste. I'm Jim Masters, 53, widowed, semi-retired, and living on the same plot of land my grandfather bought when this town had only one diner and one traffic light. The HOA didn't exist back then. It came later, creeping in with the cul-de-sacs and designer mailboxes. I tolerated them. Paid my dues, kept my hedges trimmed, never parked my truck on the lawn. But lately the HOA had a new president, Corinne Thistlewood. Yes, that's her real name. And yes, she's exactly what you're imagining. Corinne moved into the neighborhood 2 years ago from a gated community 5 towns over. No one knew why she left. Rumor was a neighborhood feud. But what we did know was that she brought a clipboard, a scowl, and an obsessive love of order. Within weeks of taking over the HOA board, she rewrote half the bylaws, issued dozens of warning letters, and once threatened to fine a neighbor for having mismatched patio furniture. She was less a neighbor and more a suburban dictator with a cardigan and a color-coded binder. It was a Tuesday morning when I first realized something was off. I'd just come back from a walk with Scout, my aging golden retriever, when I noticed the rain barrel nearest the garage looked light. I tapped the side, hollow, checked the spigot, bone dry, my brows furrowed. It hadn't rained in weeks and I hadn't used the water for anything yet. I went to the others, same story, every single barrel empty. At first I thought it might be a leak, but the barrels were sealed tight, intact, and every valve was closed properly. No signs of tampering, no cracks. That's when I noticed the faint trail of wet footprints on the side of the shed, boot prints. Not mine, too small to be from any delivery guy, and they led away from the barrels around the corner toward the street. I stood there for a long moment, heart thudding with disbelief. Someone had drained my barrels during a drought, without permission. I didn't want to believe it, but I had a gut feeling. A Corinne-shaped gut feeling. Scout nudged my leg, sensing my tension. I knelt down, patting his head absently, eyes scanning the sidewalk. That's when I saw it, a damp patch near the storm drain and a distinct whiff of chlorine, not just theft, intentional waste. My jaw clenched. This wasn't just nosy. This was sabotage, and something told me the HOA queen herself had something to do with it. The next HOA meeting was that Thursday, hosted as usual at the clubhouse with its sterile beige walls and always slightly warm bottled water. I went, not because I enjoyed these bureaucratic spectacles, but because I needed to confirm my suspicion. I arrived early, sat near the back, and watched as Corinne swept in like a storm cloud in khaki slacks. She wore her usual smug expression, lips pursed like she was perpetually smelling sour milk, and she clutched her infamous binder like it contained the Constitution itself. She opened the meeting with her usual drivel about neighborhood harmony and preserving our community standards. But then, right around the part where she talked about unauthorized outdoor utilities, her eyes flicked directly to me. My gut twisted. I knew that look. She didn't even need to say my name. Her passive-aggressive tone was surgical. "We've had reports," she said, enunciating each word with a syrupy, fake smile, "of unregulated water collection on private property. I just want to remind everyone that standing water attracts mosquitoes and violates Article 14, subsection B of the amended HOA Code." Unregulated water collection, my fists clenched under the table. Those barrels were sealed, covered, maintained. I had mosquito netting over every intake, but more than that, the gall of it. Corinne was trying to paint me like some reckless backyard swamp dweller. I raised my hand, calm but firm. "With all due respect," I said, "my rain barrels have been inspected before. They meet state guidelines, and they're not just for my garden. I've been donating that water to the local fire station for brush fire prevention." There was a brief murmur from the room. A few neighbors nodded. Everyone knew the fire season was getting worse each year, and our little volunteer station had limited resources. But Corinne didn't miss a beat. "Oh, I'm sure you believe you're doing the right thing, Mr. Masters," she said with a voice as sharp as a tack. "But the HOA has a duty to ensure consistency. One person's exception becomes everyone's excuse." I didn't reply, not because I didn't have the words, but because I knew arguing logic with Karen was like trying to play chess with a pigeon. She'd knock over the pieces, squawk a lot, and still declare victory. After the meeting, I approached her in the parking lot, hoping for at least a civil conversation. "Did you touch my barrels?" I asked quietly. She didn't deny it, just smiled in that condescending way that made my teeth ache. "We're all responsible for keeping this community safe. Sometimes that means making decisions others won't." That was it, no apology. No acknowledgement that she'd trespassed or dumped out a critical drought resource, just more smug righteousness. As she got into her shiny Lexus and drove off, I stood there under the flickering streetlight, anger boiling beneath my skin. She'd gone too far. It wasn't just personal now. It was war. The next few days felt like living in a low-budget spy movie. Karen didn't just stop at draining the barrels. Suddenly, I was receiving HOA violation notices like clockwork. One for a faded mailbox post. It wasn't. One for non-uniform garden edging, literal stones from my grandfather's property, and even one for unsanctioned yard decor, which turned out to be an old ceramic gnome my late wife had painted. It was as if she'd made it her full-time mission to bury me in citations. I'd laugh if it weren't so absurd. Karen had weaponized the HOA rulebook, and I was her chosen target. Other neighbors noticed too. Mrs. Connors across the street whispered that Karen had been peeking over fences with a pair of binoculars. The Johnsons said she'd knocked on their door to lecture them about the aesthetic risks of outdoor laundry lines. One guy even claimed she measured the height of his grass with a ruler. It was getting ridiculous. But the worst came one blistering afternoon when I caught her on my property again. I'd stepped out back to check on Scout when I heard rustling behind the shed. And there she was, clipboard in hand, phone camera out, pointing directly at my newly refilled barrels. "Karen," I shouted, marching over, "you are not authorized to be back here." She turned, unsurprised, like she'd been waiting for me. "I'm documenting potential violations for the HOA file. This is my duty." I blocked her shot, standing directly in front of the barrels. "No, it's trespassing. Again. And unless you want to explain that to a judge, I suggest you leave." She sniffed as if my very presence offended her and turned to walk away. "I'll be filing a formal complaint. You're creating an unsafe environment." I watched her go, stunned by the sheer gall, but something had shifted. This wasn't just about rain barrels anymore. Karen had made it personal, and she had no intention of stopping. That much was clear. I tried calling the HOA board directly, bypassing Karen, but she had them wrapped around her finger. One guy told me, "Karen says your barrels are in violation of new drought compliance rules." Another said, "She showed us photos. If you could just move them indoors." Indoors. They were 60-gallon barrels. What was I supposed to do, wheel them into my living room? That's when I knew no help was coming from within the HOA. Karen had framed the whole thing like I was the neighborhood menace, and most folks either believed her or were too scared of getting on her bad side to speak up. Back in my shed that night, I sat down beside Scout, staring at the empty complaint envelope in my hands. The fire station was relying on that water. The town was under burn advisories, and here was Karen dumping it all out like she was saving the world from a rogue sprinkler. No, this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The turning point came on a Friday morning just after dawn. I'd driven out to the local fire station with 3 new barrels in the bed of my pickup, freshly filled from the last small storm we'd had. Chief Morales met me out back, wiping sweat from his brow despite the early hour. "Jim, I gotta say, you've been a godsend. We're rationing like crazy out here. This water's helped us keep the brush from flaring up near the east trails." That did it, hearing it from him, confirmation that the rain barrels weren't just a backyard project, but something helping the entire town, lit a fire under me. Karen wasn't just meddling. She was interfering with public safety, with my contribution to keeping this community safe. All because the sight of a plastic barrel didn't match her vision of Stepford perfection. On my way home, I stopped by City Hall. There I dug through public records, fire code exemptions, and municipal water usage guidelines. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. An ordinance passed 2 years ago in response to increased wildfire risk. Any resident donating rainwater for emergency services was considered in compliance with all local and neighborhood drought measures, even overriding HOA guidelines. I printed 3 copies, laminated 1. But I wasn't done. I still needed proof. I knew Karen had drained the barrels, but proving it, that would require a little more than boot prints and a gut feeling. So I installed a discreet trail camera on the shed, solar-powered, motion-activated, and tucked just under the eaves. Scout watched me curiously the whole time, tail thumping in support. Over the next 2 days, I refilled the barrels again partially. Not enough to lose too much if they got dumped, but enough to tempt a repeat offense. Then I waited, and sure enough, like clockwork, Karen returned. Sunday afternoon, dressed like she was going to war with a measuring tape, rubber gloves, and a smug expression. She crept around the shed, looked both ways like a cartoon villain, then unscrewed the spigots one by one. Caught red-handed. The trail cam got everything, time stamp, clear footage, even audio of her muttering about community standards and filthy water. I watched the footage 3 times that night, equal parts furious and amused. The hypocrisy was staggering. There she was, dumping gallons of potable rainwater down the drain during a fire advisory just to prove a point. I knew I had her. The camera footage, the city ordinance, and her own words in the HOA meeting. But I wasn't about to go nuclear just yet. No, that wouldn't be satisfying. Karen needed to understand what she'd done, and she needed to be humiliated in exactly the way she loved to dish out, publicly and with paperwork. So I began to plan, carefully, quietly, with the kind of patience only a retired man with too much time and a deep, unshakable grudge could master. Revenge was coming, and it was going to be entirely, beautifully legal. The beauty of a good trap is in the details. Just enough bait to tempt, just enough rope to hang. I spent the next week building my stage like a theater director with a vendetta. First, I filed a formal complaint with the city's Environmental Services Department. Not against Karen, not yet. I simply requested an inspection to ensure my property's rainwater system was compliant with municipal standards. I knew it was. I wanted that stamp of approval on record, certified and shining. The inspector came, clipboard in hand and slightly confused as to why a man with meticulously clean barrels was calling him out during a drought. He checked everything, nodded a lot, and by the end he handed me a copy of the compliance report. I framed it, literally. Hung it right next to the barrels behind a weatherproof panel. Next came the piece de resistance. I printed laminated signs for each barrel, bold red letters that read, DONATED Water, Local Fire Department Use Only, protected under Ordinance 47B. I even added the fire station's contact number just for dramatic flair. Oh, and the camera, still rolling, still catching everything. Now the final touch. I leaked a little information through the grapevine. Over morning walks and polite nods at mailboxes, I mentioned to a few particularly chatty neighbors that someone had been tampering with the barrels. Real shame, I'd say. Especially since the fire department relies on that water. Can you imagine if something caught fire out here? I never said her name. I didn't have to. Karen's reputation filled in the blanks like magic. By Thursday afternoon, the HOA newsletter arrived, and sure enough, there it was, another thinly veiled notice about unauthorized water structures and potential health hazards. I chuckled as I folded the page. She was still at it, still thinking she could shame me into compliance. But she had no idea she was walking into a trap built with her own weapons, rules, regulations, and an unhealthy obsession with appearances. That evening I invited Chief Morales to stop by. Just to take a look, I said casually. He showed up in uniform, admired the setup, and crucially, agreed to write a thank you letter from the station, printed on official letterhead, signed and sealed. I slid a copy into a waterproof folder and mounted it right next to the compliance certificate. The stage was set. All I needed now was Karen to strike again. And like a moth to a fluorescent HOA-approved porch light, she wouldn't be able to resist. It was only a matter of time before she came sniffing around, saw the signs, ignored them, and did exactly what I was counting on her to do. Scout seemed to sense it too. He lay by the shed more than usual, tail thumping with anticipation every time the wind rattled the barrels. Almost there, buddy, I said, scratching behind his ears. Almost time to roll the credits on the Karen show. It happened on a Saturday morning. Not early, not late, just that perfect HOA hour when everyone was trimming hedges, polishing lawn gnomes, and pretending not to judge their neighbors. I was in the garage, tinkering with an old lawnmower just within earshot of the shed when I heard the telltale sound of nosy sneakers crunching gravel. I didn't have to look. I knew those footsteps like I knew Scout's bark. Karen. She stood at the barrels like a monarch inspecting contraband. She eyed the laminated signs with visible irritation, her lips pursed so tight they nearly disappeared. She paced a little, looked around like she was expecting to be watched. And oh, how right she was. And then, like clockwork, she bent down, yanked the first spigot open, and started draining. But here, where things got beautiful. As soon as she twisted that nozzle, a shrill chirp sounded from a tiny, motion-triggered device I'd wired to the barrel, labeled anti-tamper system in big, bold letters. It wasn't actually connected to anything serious, just a noisy deterrent. But it startled her so badly she stumbled backward into the mulch pile, arms flailing, her pastel visor askew. She scrambled up furious and marched to the front yard, only to find Chief Morales stepping out of his cruiser. I'd given him the heads-up the night before, and sure enough, he'd timed his visit to perfection. "Good morning," he said cheerfully. "Thought I'd drop off another thank-you note for Jim. We've been filling our tanks with that water all week." Karen froze. Her face went pale, then red, like someone had switched her thermostat from judgmental to about to explode. "This water," she sputtered, pointing behind her. "You mean these illegal barrels?" The chief raised an eyebrow. "Illegal? Ma'am, those barrels are approved by the city. There's even an ordinance protecting them. Didn't you see the sign?" She flailed for words, but I walked up just in time, holding my laminated folder like a sword of truth. "You mean this asterisk sign?" I said, flipping it open to reveal both the compliance certificate and the thank you letter, crisp and clear. "Or maybe you mean the footage of you dumping it yesterday and again just now." I gestured toward the camera under the eaves, its tiny red light blinking innocently. People had started gathering. Neighbors, curious about the noise, edged closer with phones half raised. Karen turned to see half a dozen familiar faces watching her fumble. And then, oh, the cherry on top, Mrs. Connors, bless her 80-year-old heart, said loudly, "Isn't that the same woman who called the cops on a kid's lemonade stand?" Karen's jaw dropped. She looked from me to the chief, to the camera, to the signs, to the small but growing crowd. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. This is harassment," she finally muttered, brushing mulch off her pants and stomping away with the grace of a panicked ostrich. I didn't stop her. I didn't need to. The trap had been sprung and the damage was done. Public, legal, and deliciously poetic. Karen didn't show her face for 3 whole days. In HOA time, that was practically a sabbatical. Her usual morning power walks, where she inspected everyone's front yard like a royal parade, ceased. The email blasts, the passive-aggressive lawn care memos, even the clipboard clutched like a holy relic, gone. It was as if the woman had been swallowed whole by the very suburban perfection she worshipped. But the neighborhood hadn't forgotten. Oh no, word of the showdown spread faster than a gas leak at a barbecue. By Monday, there were memes floating around the community Facebook group. Someone posted a still image from the camera footage, Karen mid-flail, visor askew, eyes wide, and captioned it HOA Karen, defender of dry ditches. Another one labeled her the Drought Avenger and featured her brandishing a hose with a crossed-out rain cloud behind her. I had nothing to do with it. Mostly. Probably. The best part? People started putting out their own rain barrels, not because they needed to, many just filled them with tap water and food coloring, but as a not-so-subtle gesture of rebellion. Bright blue barrels popped up like protest flowers. One guy painted his to look like R2-D2. The Johnsons labeled theirs Karen Repellent. Someone else added a sign, "This barrel is under emotional surveillance." By the end of the week, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. This time, Karen wasn't at the head of the table. She sat stiffly off to the side, cheeks flushed, hands clamped around her lemon water like it was the last defense she had left. I didn't even speak. I didn't have to. The chief showed up again and addressed the room calmly. "I just want to clarify," he said, holding up a folder. that Jim's rainwater donations have directly helped us prevent 2 minor brush fires this month. This neighborhood is fortunate to have residents who care enough to go above and beyond. We hope others will consider doing the same. It was surgical, a public praise that doubled as a slap in Karen's face. When the floor opened for questions, someone finally asked the golden one. So, what are the consequences for someone who tampered with the water? Karen stiffened. Chief Morales didn't flinch. If a formal complaint were filed, it would be considered destruction of property and interference with emergency resource management. Fines, possibly a court date, depends on the intent. The room went quiet. Karen squirmed in her seat like a kid caught stealing cookies. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she muttered, "I wasn't aware of the ordinance." That was her first mistake, because everyone remembered her speech from weeks ago, how she'd scolded people for not reading every HOA update, every legal detail. Now, caught by her own logic, she had nowhere to hide. She didn't apologize, not really. She mumbled something about misunderstandings and moving forward, then bolted from the meeting the second it adjourned. But the damage was done. Karen, queen of the clipboard, had been dethroned by her own obsession with rules. After the HOA meeting, things settled in the way a town does after a summer storm, quiet, refreshed, and just a little more colorful than before. Karen didn't resign officially, but she stopped trying to run the neighborhood like a one-woman military camp. Her clipboard disappeared. The newsletters got shorter. The violation notices suspiciously absent. It was like watching a lion turn into a house cat overnight, still haughty, still sharp-eyed, but far less likely to bite. As for me, I went back to my peaceful little routine. The barrels stayed full, untouched, now proudly displayed like rain-harvesting trophies. Scout seemed to strut a little more on our walks, head high, tail up, as if he knew we defended the homestead from HOA tyranny. The fire station kept stopping by for refills, always with a nod of thanks or a friendly honk as they passed. One of the volunteers even dropped off a patch with their logo, which I framed right under the compliance certificate. Neighbors who'd once kept their heads down started chatting more, asking about rain collection, swapping DIY barrel ideas. One guy, Greg from 2 doors down, even built a custom barrel stand with cup holders, just in case we want to toast to pettiness in style, he joked. It was ridiculous. It was wonderful. Then came the kicker. A city council rep showed up one afternoon, clipboard in hand, the irony was not lost on me, and presented me with a community recognition certificate for outstanding civic contribution and environmental responsibility. I accepted it humbly, then pinned it next to the now iconic Karen repellent, signed someone left on my porch anonymously. Whoever did it had a solid sense of humor. They even added a little drawing of her visor with a red circle and slash. Karen, well, she kept her distance. If we passed each other on the street, she'd give a stiff nod and move on quickly, like a ghost from a story no one wanted to remember out loud. Her authority never quite recovered, and though she still lurked around the HOA email chain, her messages were more cautious now, always double-checked for tone. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the hills and painted the sky with those fire-orange streaks that only drought seasons deliver, I sat out on my porch with a glass of iced tea and Scout by my side. The barrels gleamed softly in the light. Peace restored. I leaned back and chuckled to myself. Who knew water, of all things, would be the hill she chose to fight on? In a community built on rules, she broke the most important one. Never mess with someone doing good for others, especially not during fire season. Because sometimes poetic justice doesn't come with a bang. It comes with a drip. A slow, steady drip of sweet legal satisfaction.